Story 1, The Thaw. Rachel Nguyen's thermometer showed the permafrost was melting at 17 feet below the surface, which meant something had been generating heat down there for at least 3 weeks. Nothing generated heat in permafrost. Nothing lived that deep. The ground had been frozen solid for 12,000 years, since the last ice age, and now her sensors were showing temperatures climbing from -5 Fahrenheit to 42 degrees in a concentrated area roughly 30 feet in diameter. She was alone at the Koyukuk Research Station, 200 miles north of Fairbanks, studying climate change impacts on tundra ecosystems. Her 2 colleagues had flown back to Anchorage for Thanksgiving, leaving her to monitor the automated systems. The station was a cluster of prefab buildings surrounded by endless white nothing, the nearest human being a bush pilot 3 hours away by plane, weather permitting. The heat signature had appeared 4 days ago. Rachel had assumed it was a sensor malfunction, but she'd checked the equipment twice, recalibrated everything, even dug down 6 feet with a soil auger to manually verify the temperature. The readings were accurate. Something was warming the permafrost from below. She pulled up the thermal imaging data on her laptop. The heat source was moving. Slowly, maybe 6 inches per hour, but definitely moving upward through the frozen soil. In another 18 hours, it would reach the surface. Rachel tried calling her supervisor at the University of Alaska. No answer. The satellite phone showed a connection, but the line just rang endlessly like it was calling into a void. She left a message. "Dr. Morrison, it's Rachel. I've got an anomaly at the Koyukuk site. Significant thermal event in the permafrost, unknown origin. Please advise." She went outside to check the monitoring well. The November darkness was complete at 3 in the afternoon, the polar night turning Alaska into a land of endless black punctuated only by stars and the green shimmer of aurora. Her breath froze instantly, ice crystals forming in her nostrils. -38 degrees, cold enough to kill exposed skin in minutes. The monitoring well was a PVC pipe sunk 20 feet into the ground, fitted with temperature probes at various depths. Rachel aimed her flashlight down the pipe. The probes at 15 and 17 feet were glowing. Actually glowing, a soft orange light pulsing rhythmically, like a heartbeat. Probes didn't glow. They were simple electronic sensors, no lights, no moving parts. But she could see the glow clearly, and as she watched, it grew brighter, more intense. Rachel pulled back from the well. Her hands were shaking, and not from the cold. She'd been doing permafrost research for 6 years, had drilled hundreds of monitoring wells, had seen every kind of soil condition and thermal anomaly. She'd never seen anything like this. The ground beneath her feet vibrated. Subtle, barely perceptible, but definitely there. A low-frequency hum that she felt in her bones more than heard. Rachel stepped away from the monitoring well, her boots crunching on snow, and the vibration followed her. It was coming from everywhere, from the entire 30-foot diameter area that her sensors had identified as the thermal anomaly. She ran back to the station, locked the door, turned on every light. The building felt insubstantial suddenly, thin walls and insulated panels that wouldn't stop anything that could melt permafrost from below. Rachel pulled up the seismic monitors on her computer. The vibration was registering, a steady 3.2 hertz oscillation, too regular to be natural, too focused to be an earthquake. Her satellite phone rang. Rachel grabbed it. "Dr. Morrison." Static answered, thick and crackling. Then a voice emerged, distorted, speaking words that might have been English but sounded wrong, the syllables reversed or inverted. Rachel's linguistics training kicked in. She'd minored in Athabascan languages, and she realized with creeping horror that the voice was speaking backward. Actually backward, phonemes reversed, like someone playing a recording in reverse. She hung up. The phone rang again immediately. She didn't answer. Outside, the glow from the monitoring well was visible through the window now, bright enough to cast orange light across the snow. Rachel watched as the light intensified, pulsing faster, the rhythm accelerating from 1 beat per second to 2, then 4, then so fast it became almost solid. The well exploded. Not violently, but the PVC pipe simply shattered, fragments flying outward, and something emerged from the hole. Rachel pressed her face against the window, her breath fogging the glass. It looked like steam at first, a column of vapor rising from the ground. but steam dissipated. This didn't. It held together, forming a vaguely cylindrical shape about 8 feet tall, and as Rachel watched, the vapor began to condense into something more solid, not quite physical but more present than mere gas. The shape moved toward the station. Rachel could see through it, could see the snow behind it, but she could also see details forming within the translucent mass. Structures that might have been bones, organs, a network of branching vessels like a circulatory system made of light. She backed away from the window. The thing reached the station wall and didn't stop. It passed through the insulated panel like the wall wasn't there, bringing with it a wave of heat so intense Rachel gasped. The temperature in the room jumped from 65 to 90 degrees in seconds. Her laptop screen fogged over. Condensation dripped from the ceiling. The shape stood in the center of the room, pulsing, radiating heat. Rachel could smell it now, something organic and ancient, like peat and decay and mineral deposits, the smell of deep earth. The shape was still forming, details emerging from the vapor. She could see what might have been a face, features that were almost human but distorted, elongated, the proportions wrong. "What are you?" Rachel whispered. The shape responded, not with words but with images that appeared directly in her mind. Vast ice sheets covering the land, mammoths walking across frozen tundra, then something falling from the sky, a meteor or spacecraft, burning as it entered the atmosphere, slamming into the ice with enough force to create a crater half a mile wide. But it wasn't a meteor. It was something alive, something that had been traveling between stars, and the impact had buried it under hundreds of feet of ice and rock, trapped it in permafrost that formed over millennia, froze it in suspended animation for 12,000 years. Until climate change began thawing the permafrost, until Rachel's research station happened to be positioned directly above its prison. The images kept coming, flooding Rachel's mind. The thing waking slowly as the ice around it melted, generating heat to accelerate its thaw, breaking down the frozen soil molecule by molecule, climbing toward the surface and freedom. "You're not from Earth," Rachel said, her voice shaking. "You've been frozen since the Pleistocene." The shape pulsed brighter, confirming. More images, other beings like it, scattered across Earth 12,000 years ago when their ship broke apart in the atmosphere, each one buried in different locations, most of them still frozen, still waiting. This one had gotten lucky, had been buried in permafrost that was finally, after millennia, beginning to thaw. Rachel's laptop chimed. She glanced at the screen, now unfogged. The thermal imaging showed 17 new heat signatures across Alaska, all of them following the same pattern. Concentrated warming in permafrost zones, rising temperature profiles, upward movement. They were all waking up. All 18 of the beings that had crashed in Alaska 12,000 years ago were thawing simultaneously, responding to climate change, to the warming that humanity had caused. "What are you going to do?" Rachel asked. The shape moved closer. Rachel could feel the heat radiating from it, could feel sweat running down her back despite her terror. The thing reached out, not with a limb exactly, but with an extension of itself, a tendril of vapor and light, and touched her forehead. Images exploded in her mind. The beings emerging from permafrost, gathering, communicating across hundreds of miles using frequencies humans couldn't detect. They weren't hostile. They were stranded, had been stranded for 12,000 years, and now they finally had a chance to signal for rescue, to call their kind from wherever they'd originated. But the signal would be powerful, powerful enough to interfere with every electronic system on Earth, powerful enough to scramble satellites, disable power grids, erase data from computers and phones and every piece of technology humanity depended on. Not an attack, just a side effect of the frequency they needed to transmit across interstellar space. Civilization would collapse, not from invasion but from trying to save themselves. When, Rachel asked. The shape showed her, 37 hours. The time it would take for all 18 beings to fully emerge and coordinate their transmission. "Can you wait? Can you give us time to prepare?" The shape pulsed negative. They'd been waiting 12,000 years. They'd been conscious, aware, trapped in ice and darkness for longer than human civilization had existed. They were done waiting. Rachel felt tears on her cheeks. No one will believe me, I can't stop this. The shape withdrew its tendril. The images stopped. Rachel was left standing in her overheated station, watching the being fade back into vapor, watching it flow out through the walls and return to the hole in the ground. The heat signatures on her laptop were multiplying. 19 now, 23, 31. The sensors were détected. Seating them all across Alaska, all across Siberia, all across Canada and Scandinavia. Everywhere permafrost was thawing. Everywhere the frozen ground was releasing what it had held for millennia. Rachel tried her satellite phone. Dead. Every communication system was dead, the beings already interfering with electronics just by existing, their mere presence scrambling signals. She was alone in the dark, 200 miles from the nearest human, watching on her dying laptop as heat signatures bloomed across the Arctic like flowers opening, like wounds bleeding light into the frozen ground. In 37 hours, they would all emerge. In 37 hours, they would send their signal. And humanity would wake up to find their technology gone, their civilization crippled, their world forever changed by something that had been sleeping beneath their feet since the last ice age. Rachel walked outside. The aurora was brighter than she'd ever seen it, green and purple ribbons dancing across the sky. Except she realized with dawning horror that it wasn't aurora. The light was coming from below, from the ground, from hundreds of heat signatures across the Arctic, all glowing in unison, all preparing to wake, all preparing to call home. The permafrost had been humanity's time capsule, preserving megafauna and ancient viruses and things that shouldn't exist. And now the capsule was opening. Now the thaw was releasing not just methane and carbon, but something far stranger, far older, far more alien than anyone had imagined. Rachel looked down at the glowing hole where the monitoring well had been. The being was gone, descended back into the earth to prepare. But she could still feel its heat, could still feel the vibration in the ground, could still see the afterimages it had burned into her mind. She had 37 hours to decide. Try to warn people who wouldn't believe her, or simply wait for the world to change, for the signal to erase everything electronic, for humanity to be sent back to a pre-technological state by accident, by side effect, by beings who just wanted to go home. Rachel chose to wait. She sat in the snow outside the station, watching the ground glow beneath her, watching the sky fill with false aurora, and she thought about how climate change had consequences no one had predicted. They'd worried about sea level rise and crop failures and refugee crises. They hadn't worried about waking ancient aliens from their permafrost tombs. The thaw continued. The beings rose. And Rachel Nguyen, alone in the Arctic darkness, watched the world end not with violence but with light, with heat, with the desperate cry of stranded travelers finally calling for rescue after 12,000 years of frozen silence. Story 2, The Missing Mile. The highway stretched exactly 173 miles between the towns of Tok and Northway, except when Gabriel Torres drove it on November 9, 2023. It measured 174 miles. One extra mile that didn't appear on any map, didn't show up on his GPS, didn't exist according to the Alaska Department of Transportation records he'd looked up before starting his drive. Gabriel noticed because he was meticulous, a civil engineer who measured everything, who trusted numbers and data. He'd reset his trip odometer in Tok, had watched it tick up mile by mile as he drove east on the Alaska highway toward the Canadian border. At mile marker 173, the last marker before Northway, his odometer read 174. One extra mile, unaccounted for, impossible. He pulled over at the Northway junction, idling his pickup truck, staring at the numbers. His GPS showed he'd traveled exactly 173 miles. The highway markers agreed, but his odometer, factory calibrated, never wrong, insisted he'd driven 174. Gabriel drove the route again, heading west back toward Tok. This time he counted mile markers manually, using a tally counter app on his phone. Click for each marker that passed. At marker 1, back in Tok, his phone showed 173 clicks. 173 markers, 173 miles. But his odometer showed 174 miles traveled. The extra mile existed. Somewhere between Talk and Northway, there was a stretch of highway that measured longer than it should, a mile that the maps didn't acknowledge, that GPS couldn't see. Gabriel was supposed to be surveying a bridge repair site near Talk, but the missing mile consumed him. He drove the route a third time, slower, watching for any discrepancy. Everything looked normal: spruce forests, frost-heaved asphalt, the occasional rusted vehicle abandoned on the shoulder. The Tanana River Valley stretched to the south, the Alaska Range to the north, white peaks against darker gray sky. Normal, except for the mile that shouldn't exist. Oh. In his fourth drive-through, Gabriel started timing his trip between mile markers, using his phone's stopwatch. At 60 miles per hour, each mile should take exactly 1 minute. Most markers timed out correctly, 58 to 62 seconds, accounting for slight variations in speed. But between mile marker 87 and 88, his timer showed 2 minutes and 11 seconds. He'd driven that stretch at a constant 60 miles per hour. His cruise control confirmed it, but somehow it had taken twice as long as it should have. The missing mile was between markers 87 and 88. Gabriel pulled over immediately after marker 88. The highway behind him looked normal: 2 lanes, faded yellow line, snow piled on the shoulders. He could see marker 87 in the distance, maybe a mile back, exactly where it should be. He got out of the truck. The November cold bit into his face, 30 below, the kind of cold that made his teeth ache. No other vehicles on the road. The sun was setting, though setting was generous. This far north in November, the sun barely cleared the horizon before sinking again, giving maybe 4 hours of twilight. Gabriel walked back toward mile marker 87, his boots crunching on packed snow at the road's edge. He counted his steps, a surveyor's habit. At 3,200 steps, roughly a mile and a half, he still hadn't reached marker 87. That was wrong. He'd only driven a mile between the markers, but he'd walked more than a mile and the marker wasn't getting closer. If anything, it looked farther away, a small reflective rectangle in the distance that refused to approach. Gabriel stopped walking. His breath hung in the air, ice crystals glittering. He turned around to look back at his truck, parked beyond mile marker 88. The truck was gone. Not just the truck, mile marker 88 was gone. The highway behind him ended in a wall of white fog, thick and impenetrable, cutting across the road like someone had drawn a line and said, "Nothing beyond this point." Gabriel ran toward the fog. His engineer's mind screamed that fog didn't behave like this, didn't form walls, didn't stay stationary when air currents should disperse it. But he ran anyway, terror overriding rationality. He hit the fog at full sprint and bounced off it. Actually bounced like he'd run into a padded wall. The fog was solid, or semi-solid, yielding slightly under impact but not parting, not letting him through. Gabriel pounded on it with his fists. The fog felt like cold rubber, giving a few inches, then pushing back. "Hey," he shouted, "someone help." His voice didn't echo. The sound vanished the moment it left his mouth, swallowed by the unnatural silence of the missing mile. Gabriel turned back toward mile marker 87. Still distant, still unreachable. He was trapped in a stretch of highway that existed but didn't exist, a mile that the maps denied but that he was standing in, a space between 2 markers that should have been adjacent but somehow contained infinite distance. He walked forward toward marker 87, counting steps again. At 5,000 steps, nearly 2 miles, the marker looked exactly as far away as when he'd started. The highway wasn't obeying normal geometry. Gabriel was walking through space that didn't correspond to physical distance, moving without getting closer, trapped in a loop or a fold or some violation of basic physics. His phone had no signal, which was normal for this stretch of highway. What wasn't normal? The time showed 7:43 p.m., but the sky was the same twilight gray it had been when he'd pulled over at 4:15 p.m. 3.5 hours had passed, but the sun hadn't moved, the darkness hadn't deepened. Time was wrong here. Distance was wrong. The missing mile wasn't just extra space, it was broken space, a place where the rules didn't apply. Gabriel tried walking in the opposite direction, back toward the wall of fog. Same result. He walked and walked but never got closer. The fog remained fixed at the same impossible distance, always receding as he approached. He was stuck, trapped in the middle of the missing mile with no way forward or back. Panic set in properly then. Gabriel sat down in the middle of the highway, his breath coming fast and shallow, his mind racing through possibilities. Hallucination. No, the cold was too real, too immediate. Breakdown of some kind. But everything felt normal except for the geometry. Supernatural. He didn't believe in supernatural, but he was sitting in a mile of highway that broke physics, so belief seemed irrelevant. A sound interrupted his spiraling thoughts. An engine, distant but approaching. Gabriel stood, hope flaring. Another vehicle, someone else on the highway, someone who could help or at least confirm that this was real, that he wasn't losing his mind. Headlights appeared in the distance, approaching. From the direction of mile marker 87, a truck, moving fast, heading his way. Gabriel waved his arms, shouting, trying to flag it down. The truck didn't slow. It passed through the space where Gabriel stood, the headlights sweeping over him, the grille close enough to touch. Gabriel felt wind from its passage, smelled diesel exhaust. But the truck didn't hit him, didn't even register his presence. It kept driving, heading toward the fog wall. Gabriel watched it approach the wall and pass through without slowing, disappearing into the white as if the barrier didn't exist for it. Gabriel ran after it, reached the fog, bounced off again. The truck had gone through. He couldn't. Whatever physics applied to vehicles didn't apply to him. More headlights, another truck approaching from 87. Gabriel stood in the middle of the highway, directly in its path. The truck came closer, closer, and Gabriel braced for impact. The truck passed through him. He felt a momentary cold, a sensation of displacement, and then the vehicle was past, continuing toward the fog, disappearing through the barrier. 3 more vehicles over the next hour. All of them passed through Gabriel like he was a ghost, like he wasn't physical anymore, like he'd become something that occupied space but couldn't interact with matter. He checked his body. Solid. He could touch himself, could feel the cold, could pick up snow from the roadside. He was physical, but to the passing vehicles, he didn't exist. The sun still hadn't moved. The sky remained the same gray twilight. Gabriel's phone now showed 11:58 p.m., but the light hadn't changed at all. He walked to the side of the highway, sat on the snow berm, and tried to think. The missing mile was a trap, a space that had captured him when he'd stepped outside his vehicle. The mile existed parallel to the normal highway, occupying the same coordinates but displaced somehow, removed from regular causality. Other vehicles could pass through because they were still in the normal world. Gabriel had somehow fallen into the displaced version, the missing mile that maps couldn't see, and now he was stuck. His phone died at what it claimed was 2:30 a.m. The sky remained unchanged. Gabriel's water bottle was empty. He hadn't eaten since lunch in Talk before this nightmare began. Hunger and thirst were becoming urgent, but there was nothing here, just highway and forest and endless gray twilight. He tried walking into the forest, thinking maybe he could navigate around the trap, reach normal space by going perpendicular to the highway. But the trees were like the fog. He could see them, could walk toward them, but never reached them. The forest edge remained fixed at the same impossible distance no matter how far he walked. Gabriel returned to the highway. More vehicles had passed while he was attempting the forest, their headlights cutting through him, their drivers oblivious to his presence. Despair settled in as hours became days. Gabriel's watch stopped working, the hands frozen at 4:17 p.m., the moment he'd first pulled over. His phone was dead. He had no way to measure time except by his own deteriorating state, hunger intensifying into starvation, thirst becoming unbearable, exhaustion turning his legs to rubber. But he didn't die. That was perhaps the worst part. His body demanded food and water, screamed for rest, but he remained conscious, remained aware, trapped in the missing mile where time didn't pass properly and death apparently couldn't reach. On what might have been the 5th day or 50th, Gabriel had lost count. A vehicle finally stopped. Not a truck. A state trooper's SUV, materializing from the fog wall, rolling to a halt exactly where Gabriel stood. The trooper got out, looked directly at Gabriel. "You lost." Gabriel nearly collapsed with relief. Yes, God, yes, I've been stuck here. The highway, it's not right, I can't get out. The trooper nodded like this was routine. You stopped between 87 and 88. How did you know? Happens sometimes, maybe once every few years. Someone notices the missing mile, gets curious, stops to investigate, and the mile keeps them. The trooper gestured to the fog walls at either end of the highway. You're in the space between the mile that exists but shouldn't. Department of Transportation knows about it, but we can't fix it. Can't even measure it properly. How do I get out? You don't, not on your own. You need someone to pull you out, someone who's still in normal space. The trooper opened the back door of the SUV. Get in, don't touch the sides, stay in the center of the vehicle. Gabriel climbed in, sitting rigidly in the middle of the bench seat. The trooper got back in the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove forward into the fog. The passage through the fog felt like passing through a membrane, a resistance that pushed against the vehicle, then sudden. Release, they emerged into normal highway, mile marker 88 visible ahead. The trooper pulled over. Your truck's up there, keys in the ignition. You'll want to keep driving, don't stop again between these markers. And Mr. Torres. Yes. Stop measuring things. Some questions don't need answers. Some miles are better left uncounted. Gabriel got out. The trooper's SUV drove away, disappearing around a curve. Gabriel walked to his truck, found it exactly as he'd left it, keys in the ignition, his half-finished coffee still in the cup holder. He drove to Northway without stopping, checked into a motel, slept for 18 hours. When he woke, his watch worked again, his phone had signal. Everything was normal. Except the missing mile was still there, still stretching the highway by one impossible unit, still waiting for the next curious person who would notice, who would stop, who would step into the space between markers and find themselves trapped in the mile that maps deny. Gabriel never drove that route again, and he stopped measuring things quite so carefully, stopped trusting numbers to always make sense. Because somewhere in Alaska, between 2-mile markers that should be adjacent, there's a space that breaks geometry, that traps the unwary, that exists in defiance of physics and maps. And once you notice it, once you acknowledge its existence, it notices you back. The missing mile is always there, always waiting, always hungry for someone else to stop and wonder why the numbers don't add up. Story 3, the broadcast. The AM radio in Ethan Park's cabin picked up a station that didn't exist. Frequency 1670 at the extreme end of the dial, broadcasting through static and interference. A woman's voice reading a list of numbers and coordinates, hour after hour, in flat, emotionless monotone. Ethan wouldn't have noticed, except his radio's scan function kept stopping on 1670, refusing to skip past it, treating the static-filled signal as a strong station, even though the FCC database showed no licensed broadcaster at that frequency in Alaska. He was spending the winter alone in a cabin outside of Chicken, a tiny community in the eastern interior, population 17. The cabin had no internet, no cell service, no television. Radio was his only connection to the outside world, and his old transistor radio pulled in maybe 6 stations on good days. A couple from Fairbanks, one from Whitehorse in Yukon Territory, occasionally something from Delta Junction. But 1670 was new. The voice was new, and the numbers made no sense. 64.9273 north, 141.3859 west. Depth 73 meters, status active, next 63.1112 north, 143.0041 west. Depth 108 meters, status emerging. Coordinates, depths, status readings. The woman read them continuously, occasionally interrupted by bursts of static or strange clicking sounds, then resumed exactly where she'd left off. Ethan grabbed a notebook and started writing down the coordinates. He plotted them on a topographic map of Alaska he kept tacked to the cabin wall. The locations were scattered across the interior and Arctic regions, some along the Yukon River, some in the Brooks Range, others in the North Slope tundra. And every single coordinate marked a location in permafrost. Ethan had worked for the U.S. Geological Survey before retiring to his cabin, had spent 20 years studying Alaska's geology and climate. He recognized permafrost coordinates when he saw them. The depths matched the typical thickness of frozen soil in various regions. But what was status, active supposed to mean? What was emerging? The broadcast continued through the night. Ethan fell asleep listening to it, the woman's voice a monotonous lullaby of numbers and positions. When he woke at dawn, she was still reading. 65.0034 north, 155.298 west. Depth, 91 meters. Status, signal detected. Next, 61.5577 north. Ethan tried tuning to other stations. They came in normally, playing music and news and morning shows. But whenever he returned to 1670, the woman was there, still reading coordinates. He plotted more locations throughout the day. By evening, he'd marked 47 sites across his map, all in permafrost zones, all reporting either active or emerging or signal detected. Then the broadcast changed. At 7:41 p.m., the woman's voice stopped mid-coordinate. Silence. Then a different sound, a low-frequency pulse, rhythmic like a heartbeat but slower, deeper. The pulse continued for 3 minutes. Then the woman returned. Synchronization achieved. Network online. Transmission beginning in 42 hours. The broadcast resumed reading coordinates, but now each one had a new data point. 64.9273. North 141.3859 west. Status, synchronized, signal strength, 93%. Ethan's blood went cold. Network, synchronization, transmission. This wasn't a geological survey or climate monitoring. This sounded like something coordinated, something organized, something preparing to activate. He tried researching the coordinates, but without internet, he was limited to his paper maps and reference books. The locations didn't correspond to any known research stations, military installations, or mining operations. They were just points on the tundra, permafrost, nothing else. The 42-hour countdown nagged at him. Transmission beginning. What kind of transmission? Who was broadcasting? Why? Ethan decided to visit the nearest coordinate. 64.9273 north, 141.3859 west. It was only 40 miles from his cabin, near the headwaters of the Mosquito Fork River. He could snowmobile there in a few hours. He left at dawn, following GPS coordinates on his handheld unit. The temperature was 42 below, the January sky a deep blue that hurt to look at. His snowmobile carved through fresh powder, engines screaming in the silence. The coordinate led him to a small clearing in black spruce forest. Nothing looked unusual, just snow and trees and frozen ground. But when Ethan stopped and turned off the engine, he heard it, the pulse from the radio broadcast, not coming from his snowmobile's radio, which was off, coming from the ground. A low-frequency vibration that he felt more than heard, rattling his teeth, making his vision blur slightly. The same rhythm as the broadcast pulse, slow, steady, methodical. Ethan walked around the clearing, trying to pinpoint the source. The vibration was strongest in the center, where snow had melted in a perfect circle about 8 feet in diameter. The ground inside the circle was bare, thawed, steaming slightly in the extreme cold. Permafrost shouldn't thaw in January. Permafrost that had been frozen for millennia certainly shouldn't thaw in a perfect circle and start vibrating. Ethan knelt at the edge of the circle, reaching out to touch the bare ground. It was warm. Not just thawed, but warm to the touch, maybe 60 degrees. Heat was radiating from below, melting the snow, keeping the ground unfrozen despite the ambient temperature being 70 degrees colder. He dug into the soil with his gloved hands, scooping away dirt and gravel. At 6 inches depth, he found it, a metal plate, tarnished and covered in mineral deposits, but unmistakably artificial. The plate had markings on it, symbols that might have been writing in a language Ethan didn't recognize. The vibration was coming from the plate, from underneath the plate. Ethan cleared more soil, exposing more of the plate. It was about 3 feet square, fitted precisely into the ground like a hatch or access panel. He tried to pry it up, but it wouldn't budge, either rusted shut or locked by some mechanism. His radio, the small walkie-talkie style emergency radio clipped to his belt, started picking up the 1670 broadcast even though it wasn't tuned to that frequency. The woman's voice crackled through. 64.9273 north, 141.3859 west. Status: observer present. Initiating recognition protocol. Ethan yanked the radio off his belt and threw it into the snow. But the voice continued, now coming from everywhere, from the air itself. Ethan Park, age 67, former USGS geologist, currently residing 43 miles southwest, categorized as low-threat civilian. Observation permitted. "Who are you?" Ethan shouted at the clearing. "What is this?" The voice didn't respond to his questions, just continued. Transmission countdown, 39 hours 42 minutes. Network status, 89% synchronized. Advise human observers, remain indoors during transmission window. Electromagnetic interference will temporarily disable most electronic devices. Biological effects on humans, unknown. Ethan backed away from the circle. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, to get back to his cabin, to pretend he'd never found this place. But his scientific training demanded answers. What was buried under that metal plate? Who or what was broadcasting? What was going to happen in 39 hours? He snowmobiled back to his cabin and spent the rest of the day monitoring the radio. The broadcast continued, now including regular updates. Transmission countdown, 36 hours 12 minutes. Network status, 91% synchronized. More coordinates were being added to the list. What had been 47 sites was now 63, then 81, then over 100. The network was growing, more sites activating, more points in the permafrost waking up and synchronizing. Ethan tried driving to talk, the nearest real town, to tell someone. Anyone about what he'd found, but his truck wouldn't start. The battery was dead, and his backup battery was dead too, even though both had been fully charged the day before. His snowmobile refused to start as well. Even his flashlight batteries were drained. The broadcast was somehow killing batteries, draining power from anything nearby. Ethan was effectively trapped in his cabin, forced to listen as the countdown continued. Transmission countdown, 24 hours. Network status, 97% synchronized. He burned through his firewood trying to stay warm as the temperature outside dropped to 55 below. His cabin's propane heater still worked, no batteries required, but just barely. He huddled by the radio, listening, waiting, terrified of what would happen when the countdown reached 0. At 12 hours remaining, the broadcast changed again. New information, purpose, signal relay, target, homeworld, designation unpronounceable in human language. Distance, 47 light-years. Message, stranded population located, requesting extraction. Earth year, 2023. Ethan's hands shook. Homeworld, stranded population. This was a distress beacon. Something had been buried in Alaska's permafrost, waiting, and now that climate change was beginning to thaw the frozen ground, things were waking up, synchronizing across hundreds of sites, preparing to send a message to something 47 light-years away. At 1 hour remaining, the broadcast included a warning. Transmission commencing 60 minutes. Electromagnetic pulse radius 400 kilometers. Duration 17 minutes. Advise all humans within radius. Unplug electronic devices. Seek interior shelter. Avoid windows. Biological effects. Possible temporary sensory disruption. Memory disturbance. Long-term effects unknown. Ethan was well within 400 kilometers of the nearest site. He unplugged his radio, his heater, everything. Sat in the dark cabin wearing every layer of clothing he owned, waiting. At 0 hour, the transmission began. The world turned inside out. That's the only way Ethan could describe it later, when he tried to explain to the USGS investigators who came to his cabin 3 weeks afterward. The world inverted, like reality folded through itself, and for 17 minutes Ethan existed in a space that wasn't quite physical. He saw things during those 17 minutes. Vast networks of frozen beings buried across Earth's polar regions, hundreds of thousands of them, maybe millions, all trapped in permafrost since a ship malfunction had crashed them here during the last ice age. He saw their world, their homeworld, a place of methane seas and ammonia ice. He saw their desperate plan. Wait for the ice to melt naturally, then signal for help, hoping their civilization would still exist after 12,000 years. He saw the signal itself, a burst of modulated neutrinos that could pass through the Earth without being absorbed, could travel through interstellar space without degrading, could reach across 47 light-years and say, "We're still here. Come get us." And then the 17 minutes ended. Reality reasserted itself. Ethan was back in his cabin, shivering, his nose bleeding, his memories of what he'd seen already fragmenting and fading. His radio was dead, fried by the electromagnetic pulse. His truck's electronics were fried. Every battery in the cabin had been drained to zero, but he was alive. Over the following days, news filtered in from the outside world, relayed by a bush pilot who happened to land in Chicken. Massive technological failures across Alaska, parts of Yukon Territory, and eastern Siberia. Satellites had malfunctioned. Power grids had flickered. Millions of electronic devices had simply died. Authorities blamed solar flares, electromagnetic anomalies, equipment failures. They sent investigators to interview people in affected areas. When they reached Ethan's cabin, he told them everything. They didn't believe him, or they didn't want to believe him. They took his notes, his maps, promised to investigate the coordinates. But Ethan knew they'd find nothing. The beings had gone dormant again after the transmission, buried themselves deeper, waiting for the response from their homeworld. A response that would take 47 years to arrive. Ethan was 67 years old. He wouldn't live to see what happened when that response came, when ships from another world arrived in Earth's orbit and demanded the return of their stranded population. But someone would. Someone would be alive in 47 years in 2070, when the sky filled with objects that weren't meteors or satellites, when the permafrost thawed again and released not refugees but an army, when humanity learned that Earth had been a prison for 12,000 years, and the sentence was finally ending. Ethan unpinned the map from his cabin wall and burr. Net it, let the future worry about the future. He'd done his part by documenting the transmission, by recording what he'd seen. The AM radio stayed silent on frequency 1670. But sometimes, late at night, Ethan thought he could still hear the woman's voice reading coordinates, counting down to something inevitable. The broadcast was over, but the countdown to arrival had just begun. Story 4, The Breath. The fog over Kashimak Bay had been breathing for 3 days when Yuki Tanaka finally admitted she wasn't hallucinating. Fog didn't breathe. Fog didn't expand and contract in rhythmic patterns, didn't pulse like living tissue, didn't respond to human presence by thickening or thinning. But this fog did. Yuki ran a small marine research station on the Homer Spit, studying ocean acidification and climate change impacts on shellfish populations. She was alone at the station during the off-season, with most of her colleagues at winter conferences or on sabbatical. The solitude normally didn't bother her. She preferred it, actually, the quiet focus of solo research. But the fog changed everything. It had rolled in from the bay 3 days ago, a dense gray mass that swallowed the spit, reducing visibility to 20 feet. Normal winter fog for coastal Alaska. Except within hours, Yuki noticed the pattern. The fog would thicken, becoming almost solid, then thin slightly, becoming translucent, then thicken again. Every 6 seconds. Exactly 6 seconds. Expansion and contraction like breathing. She'd timed it obsessively with her stopwatch. 6.02 seconds per cycle, never varying more than 1/10 of a second. Perfect rhythm, perfect consistency. Fog didn't behave like that. Fog responded to temperature gradients, wind currents, humidity changes. Fog didn't maintain perfect rhythm regardless of environmental conditions. On the second day, Yuki noticed the fog was warm. Not ice fog, which formed in extreme cold. Warm fog, maybe 50 degrees, which made no sense when the ambient air temperature was 15 degrees. She'd stuck a thermometer out the station window and watched it climb from 15 to 50 within seconds of entering the fog, then drop back to 15 when she pulled it back. The fog was generating heat. The fog was breathing warmth into the freezing air. On the third day, today, Yuki noticed the fog was responding to her. When she approached the windows, the fog thickened, pressing against the glass like something trying to see inside. When she moved away, it thinned. When she spoke, the breathing rhythm accelerated slightly, the cycle speeding to 5.3 seconds. The fog was aware of her. Yuki tried calling her supervisor in Anchorage. No cell signal, which was normal during fog. The landline was dead, which wasn't normal but could be explained by down lines. The internet was out. Her emergency radio picked up nothing but static. She was cut off, isolated on the spit with a fog bank that breathed and watched and responded. At noon, or what her watch claimed was noon, though the light hadn't changed, the fog keeping everything in perpetual gray twilight, Yuki saw shapes in the fog. Not distinct shapes, but suggestions, tall columns that might have been trees or buildings or people, moving slowly through the gray. The shapes kept pace with the breathing rhythm, appearing during the expansion phase, fading during contraction. Yuki grabbed her camera and photographed the shapes through the window. The images showed only gray fog, but to her naked eye, the shapes were there, tall and columnar and definitely moving with purpose. She needed to document this properly, needed to collect samples, measure the fog's composition, understand what was happening. Yuki put on her winter gear and opened the station door. The fog poured in. It moved like liquid, flowing through the doorway, filling the station with warm gray. Yuki could feel it on her skin, could taste it, metallic and organic simultaneously, like blood mixed with ocean water. The fog had texture, almost viscous, clinging to her exposed face. She stumbled back inside and slammed the door. The fog that had entered didn't dissipate. It hung in the air of the station, maintaining its density, still breathing, thicken, thin, thicken, thin. 6 seconds per cycle. Yuki ran to the bathroom and scrubbed her face with soap and water. The metallic taste remained. Her skin tingled where the fog had touched, a sensation like mild electrical current. Through the window, the columnar shapes were closer now. They'd surrounded the station, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all tall, 20 or 30 feet, and all breathing in perfect synchronization. Thicken, thin, thicken, thin. Yuki's radio crackled to life. Not voices. A sound like wind through a narrow canyon, or like something very large inhaling and exhaling. The sound matched the visual rhythm of the fog, 6 seconds in, 6 seconds out. "What are you?" Yuki whispered. The radio responded with the breathing sound, but modulated now, almost like it was trying to form words. She heard syllables in the wind sound, fragments that might have been language. Yuki grabbed her laptop and opened her audio analysis software. She recorded 30 seconds of the radio sound, then ran it through spectral analysis. The waveform showed clear patterns, repeating structures, harmonics, frequency modulations that looked remarkably like human speech, but pitched too low, stretched too long. She adjusted the playback speed, increasing it by a factor of 8. The breathing sound became something else. Words, English words, a voice saying, "We are breath, we are exhalation, we are the space between living and dying, we came from the ocean deep. We rose when the water warmed, we breathe now, we expand now, we seek now." Yuki's hands shook so badly she could barely type. She recorded more of the radio sound, adjusted it again. The voice continued, "You are small breath, you are short exhalation, your species breathes fast, lives fast, dies fast. We have been breathing for eons, we breathe in centuries, we exhale in millennia, your world grows warm, we rise, we expand, we consume." "Consume what?" Yuki asked aloud. The fog thickened against the windows, pressing so hard the glass cracked. The voice from the radio slowed down to human-comprehensible speed. "Consume breath, consume exhalation. Consume the gas you release, the oxygen you waste, the carbon you produce. We are born from warm water. We feed on breath. We grow when you exhale." Yuki understood then, the pieces assembling into a horrifying picture. These were organisms from the deep ocean, living in the methane seeps and hydrothermal vents, existing at pressures and temperatures that would crush and boil surface life. Climate change was warming the ocean. The warming was bringing these things up from the depths, releasing them into the atmosphere where they could finally expand, finally breathe, finally feed on the oxygen and carbon dioxide that land animals produced. They were jellyfish of the air, plankton of the atmosphere, adapted for a different environment, now colonizing a new one. "You'll kill us," Yuki said, "if you consume the oxygen, if you change the atmosphere." The voice, "We do not kill, we breathe. Your breathing is short, ours is long. When we breathe in, you cannot. When we exhale, you can, but our breath is slow. Our inhalation lasts hours. Your species cannot hold breath for hours." The fog was still expanding, still pressing against the station. Yuki realized with creeping horror that this was the inhalation phase. The fog was drawing in oxygen, pulling it from the air, concentrating it into its warm, breathing mass, which meant the air outside the fog was becoming oxygen depleted, which meant anyone caught outside would suffocate. The station had limited air supply. Yuki checked the oxygen sensor on her wall, 20% normal, but it was dropping, 19%, 18%. The fog inside the station was consuming the oxygen, breathing it in as part of its slow, 6-second cycle. 17% oxygen, 16%. At 15%, Yuki would start experiencing symptoms, dizziness, confusion, impaired judgment. At 10%, she'd lose consciousness. At 8%, she'd die. She needed to seal the station, stop the fog from consuming any more oxygen. Yuki grabbed duct tape and started sealing the edges of the windows, the door frame, every crack where fog might be entering. But the fog inside was already there, already breathing, already consuming. 15% oxygen. Yuki felt lightheaded, her vision blurred at the edges. The radio, "Do not fear, exhalation comes soon. In 3 hours we breathe out. The oxygen returns. You will survive if you remain still, if you use breath slowly." 3 hours. Yuki checked her watch, 12:17 p.m. At 3:17 p.m., the fog would exhale, would release the oxygen it had consumed. If she could survive until then, she'd be okay. 14% oxygen. Yuki lay down on the floor, trying to slow her breathing, trying to conserve what little oxygen remained. The fog inside the station continued its rhythm. Thicken, thin, thicken, thin. Each cycle pulled more oxygen from the air. 13%. Yuki's hands and feet were tingling. Her thoughts became sluggish, disjointed. She focused on the rhythm, on the breathing, letting it become a meditation. 6 seconds in, 6 seconds out. Her breathing matching the fog's breathing, synchronizing. 12%. The columnar shapes outside were perfectly still now, all of them inhaling together, a massive coordinated breath that stretched across the entire bay. How many of these things were there? How far did they extend? Homer was a town of 5,000 people. If the fog covered the whole town, if everyone was trapped in oxygen-depleted air for 3 hours. 11%. Yuki couldn't fit. The thought, her consciousness was fragmenting, awareness coming in bursts between gray nothing. She heard the radio still speaking, the voice stretched slow. "We do not mean harm, we are nature, we are adaptation. Your species changed the ocean, we changed in response. We rise because you warmed the water, we breathe because you gave us space. This is balance, this is cycle. We breathe in, you breathe out, we breathe out, you breathe in, together now, forever now." 10% oxygen. Yuki's vision went black at the edges, tunnel vision closing in. She could still hear the radio, still feel the fog thickening and thinning, still sense the rhythm that had consumed her world. 9%. Consciousness faded. Yuki's last coherent thought, 3 hours, survive 3 hours, the fog will exhale, the oxygen will return. She passed out. When Yuki woke, her watch showed 3:45 p.m. The station was bright, normal daylight streaming through the windows. The fog was gone. The air tasted clean, fresh, maybe even oxygen-rich, like after a thunderstorm. She checked the oxygen sensor, 24%. Higher than normal. The fog had exhaled, had released not just the oxygen it had consumed, but more, enriching the atmosphere as part of its metabolic cycle. Yuki stumbled outside. The spit looked normal, snow, ice, fishing boats in the harbor. But when she looked at the bay, she saw it. A gray line on the horizon, a band of fog just visible in the distance. The organisms were still there, still breathing, still following their slow rhythm of inhalation and exhalation, a cycle measured in hours instead of seconds. Yuki drove into Homer. The town was in chaos. Emergency services overwhelmed, people hospitalized with symptoms of hypoxia, dozens of deaths reported from the fog event. The authorities were calling it a natural disaster, a freak atmospheric phenomenon, but Yuki knew better. This wasn't the last time. The organisms had found a new habitat, had discovered they could survive in the atmosphere, could feed on the breath of surface creatures. As the ocean continued to warm, more would rise from the depths. More would breathe. More would consume. Eventually, they'd synchronize. Thousands of them, millions, all breathing together in a coordinated cycle that would deplete oxygen across entire regions for hours at a time. Humanity would adapt or suffocate, would learn to live between the breaths of entities that measured time in centuries. Yuki went back to her station and wrote a report. Detailed, scientific, documenting everything she'd observed and recorded. She sent it to her supervisor, to NOAA, to every climate scientist she knew. Most dismissed it as hallucination, hypoxia-induced delusion, but a few believed. A few started looking for similar events in other warming oceans, finding patterns. Fog banks that breathed, oxygen fluctuations that followed impossible rhythms, deaths that couldn't be explained. The breath was spreading, and humanity was learning to live in the gaps between inhalations, surviving in the brief windows when the atmospheric organisms exhaled and gave back the oxygen they'd consumed. Yuki never went back to the Homer spit. The research station was abandoned, deemed unsafe after the fog event. But sometimes she drives past and looks at the bay, sees the gray line on the horizon, watches it thicken and thin in perfect rhythm. 6 seconds, always 6 seconds. The breath of something vast and ancient and utterly indifferent to human survival. The ocean was giving back what humanity had given it. Change, disruption, organisms that couldn't have existed before but now thrived in the altered environment. Balance, the voice had said, cycle. Breathe in, breathe out, try to survive the space between. Story 5, the sound. The ice in Lake Iliamna was screaming, not cracking, not groaning, not making the normal sounds of thermal contraction and expansion. Screaming. Human screams, thousands of them, coming from beneath 53 inches of solid ice. Owen Reyes heard it first at dawn, standing on the frozen lake with his ice fishing gear, drilling holes for pike. The scream came from directly below, muffled by ice but unmistakable. A man's voice, raw with terror, shouting words Owen couldn't quite make out. He stopped drilling and pressed his ear to the ice. The scream continued, and now Owen could hear others. Women, children, dozens of voices overlapping, all screaming, all begging, all trapped under the ice. Owen ran back to shore, his heart hammering. He'd fished Lake Iliamna his entire life, knew every inlet and island of Alaska's largest lake. He'd heard ice make strange sounds before, booming cracks that echoed across the frozen surface, musical tones like whale song when the ice was forming, but never screaming, never voices. He called the Alaska State Troopers from his truck. There are people under the ice, Lake Iliamna, North Shore. I can hear them screaming. NG. The dispatcher's voice was patient, practiced. Sir, have you seen anyone fall through the ice? No, but I can hear them. Dozens of people under the ice. Ice can make sounds that seem like voices, especially when it's settling. Are you sure? I know what human screaming sounds like. Send someone, please. 2 troopers arrived an hour later. Owen led them out onto the ice to the spot where he'd been drilling. The screaming continued, clear and unmistakable. The younger trooper, Lopez, knelt and pressed his ear to the ice. His face went pale. Jesus, I hear it. There's definitely something down there. The older trooper, Mackenzie, tried his radio. Dispatch, we need a dive team at Lake Iliamna, North Shore. Possible persons trapped under ice. Negative, dispatch replied. Lake surface temperature is below freezing. Water temperature is 33 degrees. No one could survive under the ice. I understand, but we're hearing sounds consistent with human distress. Request immediate dive support. Copy, be advised, weather system moving in. Dive team ETA 4 hours. 4 hours. The screaming continued the entire time. Owen and the troopers drilled more holes, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere, from the entire section of lake beneath them. The ice was 53 inches thick, thick enough to support vehicles, and showed no cracks, no holes, no signs that anyone had fallen through. The dive team arrived at noon, 3 divers with dry suits and underwater cameras. They cut a larger hole and descended, their lights disappearing into the dark water. The lead diver, Kovac, surfaced after 12 minutes. Her face was confused, disturbed. "There's nothing down there, no bodies, no one trapped, just silt and rocks and a few pike." "But the screaming," Lopez said. "I heard it underwater. It's louder down there, actually, but it's not coming from people, it's coming from the ice itself." Kovac climbed out, her dry suit dripping. "The ice is vibrating at frequencies that sound like human voices, some kind of resonance effect. I've never seen anything like it." Mackenzie frowned. "Ice doesn't vibrate on its own." "This ice does, and it's not random. The vibrations follow patterns like speech patterns, like the ice is trying to talk." The dive team collected acoustic recordings and samples of the lake water and ice. They left after an hour, promising to analyze the data. The troopers left soon after, filing a report that characterized the incident as acoustic phenomenon, non-emergency. Owen stayed. The screaming bothered him in a way he couldn't articulate. He'd lived in Alaska 43 years, had learned to trust his instincts about the wilderness. And his instincts said the ice wasn't just making noise. The ice was communicating. He walked to the village of Iliamna, population 84, and asked the elders about the lake. The Denana people had lived on these shores for thousands of years. They'd know if something was strange. An elder named Neela listened to Owen's description, then nodded slowly. "The lake is old, older than the ice ages. In our stories, the lake has memory. It remembers everything that touched it, everyone who drowned, everyone who was lost. In winter, when the ice is thick, sometimes the lake speaks. It tells the stories of the dead." "You've heard the screaming before." "Not screaming, not like you describe. But voices, yes, my grandfather heard them. His grandfather before him. The lake has been speaking more often lately, since the water started warming." Climate change. Lake Iliamna was warming like most of Alaska's lakes, ice forming later, thawing earlier, winter temperatures not as cold as they used to be. Owen had noticed it in his fishing. Species shifting, water temperatures changing, the entire ecosystem in flux. "What does it mean when the lake speaks?" Owen asked. Neela's expression was troubled. "It means the lake is waking up. The old one said the lake sleeps in winter, dreams under the ice. But when the ice gets thin, when the water warms, the lake wakes. And when it wakes, it remembers. It remembers all the death it holds, all the boats that sank, all the people who drowned. 6,000 years of death. The lake remembers it all." Owen thanked her and walked back to his truck. The screaming from the ice followed him, audible even from shore. Other villagers were gathering, listening, disturbed by the sound. Over the next 3 days, the screaming intensified. Owen camped on the shore, monitoring the ice, recording the sounds. The acoustic patterns were complex, layered. He could distinguish individual voices now. A woman calling for help in Russian, a man shouting in Denana, children crying in English. Different languages, different time periods. The ice was replaying drownings from across the lake's history, from the Russian fur traders who'd first documented the lake in the 18th century to modern times. On the 4th day, Owen noticed the ice was thinning. Not just from seasonal warming, it was January, the coldest part of winter. The ice should have been getting thicker, but his ice auger showed the thickness decreasing, 49 inches, then 46, then 41. The lake was warming from below. Owen checked the temperature of the water under the ice. 41 degrees, way too warm. Lake Iliamna shouldn't have liquid water that warm in January. The lake was heating itself, melting the ice from underneath. And the screaming was changing, no longer just replaying old drownings. Now the ice was screaming new things, warnings. "Get off the ice, the lake is waking, the lake remembers, the lake is hungry." Owen tried to get the villagers to evacuate, to move away from the shore. Some listened, most didn't. They'd lived by the lake their whole lives. A little weird ice noise wasn't going to drive them away. On the 7th day, the ice thickness dropped to 23 inches. Still thick enough to walk on, but thinning fast. The water temperature was now 51 degrees, impossibly warm. And the screaming had become a roar, a cacophony of voices all shouting at once. "The lake wakes, the lake rises, the lake takes." That night, Owen had a dream. Or maybe it wasn't a dream. Maybe it was the lake communicating directly, bypassing sound and language, inserting images directly into his sleeping mind. He saw Lake Iliamna before the ice ages, when Alaska was warmer, when the lake was volcanic, fed by geothermal vents that kept it hot year-round. He saw organisms in that ancient warm lake, organisms that had lived in the heat, that had adapted to thermal vents and sulfur-rich water. Then the ice came, the climate shifted, the lake froze and the organisms went dormant, buried in sediment at the bottom, waiting. 12,000 years of waiting. And now the climate was shifting again. The lake was warming and the organisms were waking. They were generating heat, using geothermal energy stored in the lake bed, melting the ice, preparing to return to the surface. The screaming wasn't from the ice. It was from the organisms, communicating as they woke, their acoustic signals passing through water and ice, accidentally mimicking human voices because they were resonating at the same frequencies humans used for speech. Owen woke at dawn. The ice thickness was 12 inches. The water temperature was 63 degrees. The lake was steaming, thermal vents opening on the frozen surface, hot water bubbling through. And things were moving under the ice. Owen could see them, large shapes, 20 feet long, undulating, breaking through the thinning ice in places. They looked like nothing he'd ever seen. Translucent bodies filled with bioluminescent organs, too many limbs, structures that might have been eyes or sensors or something else entirely. The ancient organisms were emerging. Species that had been dormant since the last warm period, now waking to find a world completely different from the one they'd fallen asleep in. The villagers finally evacuated. The state troopers cordoned off the area. Scientists arrived from the University of Alaska, from NOAA, from organizations Owen had never heard of. They collected samples, recorded data, tried to understand what was happening. But Owen already understood. The lake was reclaiming its ancient state. Climate change wasn't just melting ice caps and raising sea levels. It was waking ecosystems that had been frozen, dormant, waiting. Lake Iliamna wasn't the only one. Reports came in from other lakes across Alaska, Becheroff Lake, Teshikpuk Lake, dozens more. All of them warming too fast. All of them releasing organisms from sediments, from ice, from 12,000-year prisons. The screaming was just the beginning. The communication before the emergence. The warning that old things were waking, that dormant life was returning, that humanity's impact on the climate had consequences beyond drought and storms. We'd warmed the world, and in warming it, we'd released ecosystems from the past, species that didn't fit into the modern world, organisms that would compete and disrupt and change everything. Owen left Alaska after Lake Iliamna, moved to Arizona, to the desert where there were no lakes, no ice, no frozen sediments holding ancient life. But he still hears the screaming sometimes, in his dreams, the sound of the lake waking up. And he wonders how many other things are still sleeping, still waiting for the ice to melt, for the permafrost to thaw, for the climate to shift just enough to break their 12,000-year dormancy. The world is full of frozen time capsules, and we're opening them all at once. The lake remembers. The ice remembers. And soon, humanity will remember what it's like to share the world with things that predate civilization, that survived the ice ages by sleeping, and that are now waking to a woe. RLD, we accidentally made warm enough for them to live again. The screaming was just the sound of old life saying hello and asking for its world back.